Well, hello everyone, and welcome again to the Pink Flame of Liberty radio show. Sorry for the repeat last week. This is heavy Libertarian Party convention season, and I am rerunning for my rightful position, at least in my opinion, as Libertarian National Committee Secretary. So I am gone every weekend and have to record these in the wee hours in the week leading up. And some weeks that's just not possible. But fortunately, this week it is. So one thing I want to start with, well, first of all, you can always comment. You can comment on my YouTube channel with youtube.com. Just look up Pink Flame of Liberty, or you can email me at pinkflameofliberty@gmail.com. I have heard that the fact that there is a very consistent, hardcore, big L libertarian voice, that the word is making the rounds, that I exist and that this show exists, and that is just fantastic. You can also write me at that email address for advertising opportunities, which are extremely reasonable, and I would appreciate your support. You can also just support me independently at patreon.com/Pink Flame of Liberty, but shoot me an email and say that you came from listening to the show here on 1360. Now, the first thing I would like to talk about today is something that, at least to me, completely flew under the radar. Now, maybe it was just me, but even my other libertarian friends didn't know about this. And that is the preliminary approval, at least by the Republican National Committee, for a rule change that would require their nominee, who is presumed by many is going to be President Trump once again, to refuse to participate in the televised debates, which are administered by the Commission on Presidential Debates. And that whole thing, oh boy, I had a lot of feels and a lot of thoughts about that, because I find that so many people are really ignorant as to how this whole thing works. And this little bit of peevishness by the RNC, I just find to be the height of absolute hypocrisy. So I am just going to milk it for all the entertainment value that it is possibly worth. Now, I'm going to cite some of the reasons for this decision, at least as reported by the New York Times. And let's give a little bit of history, though, of how the debates came to be administered by the Commission on Presidential Debates. These debates used to be administered by the League of Women Voters. And at that time, I believe the last non-major candidate that participated substantively was Ross Perot. And since then, they kept changing the rules to keep any threats out. I know that the Commission on Presidential Debates calls itself nonpartisan. It is not. It is bipartisan. The rules constantly change. They are not fair to minor party candidates. They are designed to keep minor party candidates out, of course. They will say, no, it's just that we can't have 100 people who file for president on the debate stage. Okay, let's grant that as a given. Certainly, there can be some sort of requirements that would result in more than 2 each time, don't you think? Particularly with more and more of the country not identifying as either Republican or Democrat. And the fact that, say, the Libertarian Party has been on the ballot in 50 plus 1 jurisdictions, so 50 states plus DC, multiple times. But the way the requirements work now is that a certain amount of time prior to the debates, you have to poll a certain percentage point on certain hand-selected polls by representatives of the Commission on Presidential Debates, which is ran by 3 people. One of them's a former RNC chair, one of them's a former DNC chair, and one of them's a former leader of the League of Women Voters. It is inherently rigged to keep minor party candidates out. And these polls will ask you, do you support, the Democrat candidate? Do you support the Republican candidate, or other? And just the answers they give as to why they can't even give the names of other candidates. I can understand that, if there's 1,000 different people that you can't possibly do that, but certainly you can have some sort of criteria that is reasonable, at least where the person will be named. And I would certainly think that the Libertarian Party, which has been around for 50 years and has run presidential candidates each year, that's each cycle, each time, there's a presidential election, would certainly qualify. But the criteria that the Libertarian Party and also the Green Party has put forth, I think, is much more reasonable than expecting voters to poll for their candidates on a poll in which their candidates' names and not even the party names are mentioned. And that is that any candidate that theoretically is on enough ballots in enough states to win should be included in the debates. And that would narrow the field down very, very significantly. And in some years, it would still just be the 2 candidates. But in other years, it might be 4 or at most 5. That is not unreasonable. Not unreasonable at all, unless, of course, you have a vested interest in it being either one or the other of the duopoly candidates. And some of the justifications I have heard are just absolutely ludicrous in saying, well, we rely upon polling because these debates are just meant to narrow down the choices that people have already narrowed, between the 2 choices everyone has already narrowed themselves down to. But if there's a media freeze out on minor party candidates, then are people really narrowing down their choices? If you don't know about the options, if you don't know about the other views because of the information lockdown, have you really made a choice? It is a complete catch-22. The whole system needs to be overhauled. Before we get to that, though, speaking of overhaul, I would like to tell you about voting overhaul, and perhaps you would consider alternative voting systems in our elections, and one of them is approval voting, which is one of the sponsors of this show. Approval voting would help move us beyond this 2-party thinking, of which I am complaining. It would lead to fewer quote-unquote spoilers because voters can vote for both a candidate that they really like, who they might believe has very little chance of winning, and also a more popular candidate who does have a chance of winning. It would lead to more civility. When a group of friends wants to stay friends and are trying to decide on a restaurant or movie, they use a show of hands, which is, drumroll please, approval voting. It would lead to less polarization because the voter is not forced to focus on only 2 candidates. And because candidates want the approval of more voters, they will not stoop to the name calling that we see so often today. Again, approval voting would help move us beyond 2-party thinking. You can contact Colorado's approval voting effort by phone or text at 720-439-6000 or do a search for the approval voting party. All right, let's continue. Now, although the Commission on Presidential Debates has such an official sounding name, it is in fact a private organization which has a tremendous amount of influence on who gets to be our rulers. It is not a governmental agency. It is not any kind of official anything. It is a front group, basically, for the duopoly. But let's go to what the New York Times said the stated reasons for this, at least preliminary approval of this rule changes. And also note that the RNC can change its mind at its summer meeting, and the candidate could always just say, that's nice, but I'm not going to follow that rule. So it's somewhat toothless, but it does have great symbolic value. And part of it is that the RNC wants the Commission on Presidential Debates, so it's the CPD, to negotiate with the parties themselves rather than with the candidates on certain terms of the debate, claiming that this is the way that it would that it used to be with the League of Women Voters. So officials with the commission told the RNC in December that one of the party's demands in particular was unacceptable, having non-voting representatives of either the RNC or the DNC at the commission's board meetings. And the commission wrote that it was still studying that and other concerns the RNC had raised, including the choice of moderators, as part of its review before the 2024 campaign cycle. It is no secret that then nominee Trump thought that in 2016 that the moderators were very unfair. And I believe he also made that same claim in 2020. It was one of the 2 years, but there had been multiple complaints. Now, actually, I believe it was in 2020 that it was claimed that the moderators were unfair and biased. So Ms. McDaniel, who is the chair of the RNC, said that the commission's response seemed designed to delay any reform until it was too late to matter for the 2024 election, and it was her duty to ensure that the Republican candidates debated their opponents on a level playing field. All right, more on that when we return. Oh, welcome back. Now let's continue the discussion on the presidential debates and the Commission on Presidential Debates. I find the RNC's protestations of wanting a level playing field a case of the lady doth protest too much. If you really wanted a level playing field, you wouldn't take every opportunity to support rules that kept out minor party candidates. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think if it only kept out more leftist or what you might perceive as leftist minor party candidates, you would then be protesting that they should be included. But because you somehow, for some reason, think you're owed Libertarian votes, even though historically, if a Libertarian candidate is in the race, Libertarians such as myself simply wouldn't vote at all, and others would only slightly favor the Republican candidate over the Democrat. We do split pretty equally. I know that's not the legend. I know the legend is that we're just Republicans that smoke pot, but that is not, in fact, the case. But I have a feeling if the Libertarians weren't around, then it was just more what the RNC chair perceived as leftist candidates. All of a sudden, she would want them in the debates. But, you know, we steal votes, apparently. But in the words of one of the former LNC chairs, a LNC chair I don't particularly care for today, but he did have some words of wisdoms in the past when he said your tears are delicious and your parties will die, when we were accused of being the quote-unquote spoiler, which is just one of the most pampered, self-entitled claims that I have ever heard come from supposedly hardened politicians. But what's even more hilarious to me is what some on the left are saying about this particular decision of the RNC. So here we have Steve Bannon, who's a producer for the Rachel Maddow show, and it's like, if recent history is any guide, it's easy to imagine Republicans creating an alternative debate schedule. Well, how dare they? With Republican-approved moderators to be held in Republican-approved cities and venues. And when Democratic nominees respond that they prefer the existing model overseen by the nonpartisan commission, the RNC will balk and ask why the Democrats are afraid of the alternate model. You know, because you guys are just saints, aren't you? You know, I do think there needs to start to be some diversity in debate, and to be honest with you, I don't find the debates particularly meaningful myself. I do think most people have their mind made up by then, but it's just so funny that immediately Steve Bannon just says, what are the Republicans afraid of? I say, what are you afraid of in keeping the minor parties out? And then you have the Washington Post claiming this is just the war on truth and that the debates could be better. And I was like, oh, I my ears perked up. I'm like, is the Washington Post going to advocate that we could have more diversity in the debates? No, the commission should eliminate audiences. Okay, and give moderators the ability to cut off candidates who flagrantly flout the rules, as Mr. Trump did constantly in his first 2020 debate with then candidate Joe Biden. But these are no doubt not the sorts of changes that Republicans seek. And including other voices is no doubt the type of changes that you seek, either Washington Post editorial board. And one of these, I think it was the Maddow piece, ended with, the CBD process was nice while it lasted. Well, your tears are delicious, and hopefully the CBD will die, and that we will start to see more, what's the buzzword? Diversity in these debates to include other party voices, because, as the saying often goes, you have more choices other than Coke or Pepsi. And I really think the duopoly is severely, severely threatened by the fact that minority voices might be included. And I think the RNC may back off when they realize that this might actually open the door for true competition to enter the debate marketplace. And while they may think this is a way to get what they want with certain rule changes, I do think perhaps when they start to realize the unintended consequences that they may balk at this. But I am just laughing my libertarian rear off this whole time at both sides claiming all they want is fairness and a level playing field. No, neither of you don't. Both sides are flaming hypocrites. And speaking of the fear that the duopoly has of minor party candidates, there's a great little newsletter that I would recommend that my audience subscribe to. I recommend this often on my regular YouTube channel, and it's called Ballot Access News. You can search for it online. I would highly suggest you get the paper copy, even though you can read a lot of the articles for free online to support this very important work. But something I read with alarm and amusement is that the duopoly is now sponsoring bills to ban ranked choice voting. How dare you be able to rank your candidates? How dare you be able to have voting reform? Ranked choice voting is another type of voting reform, like it's not like it in that it's a similar process. It's like it in that it is promoting the idea that there are other ways to vote, like one of the sponsors of the show, which is approval voting. Now, in ranked choice voting, you say you have 5 candidates in a race, you rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it goes through a process of elimination where a consensus candidate is the one that eventually wins the race and has to win with a majority vote. But in California, Florida, and Tennessee, apparently the duopoly is so threatened by this that they're actually seeking to ban local municipalities from using ranked choice voting. Fortunately, we are not facing that in Colorado. Ranked choice voting is advancing in Colorado, and that makes me very, very happy. I'd like to take just another quick break to promote one of our sponsors, which is my husband. My husband is a Colorado realtor. He's been a Colorado realtor for over 30 years. And if you are in the market to buy or sell your home, I would hope that you would consider engaging a liberty-loving realtor. And of course, I could vouch for him on the highest terms. If you are interested in speaking with my husband, Wayne, about a potential real estate transaction, please just give him a call. Even if you are not ready yet, he'd be more than glad to speak with you and give you some tips, pointers, and advice, and at least get you started in the right direction. And you can reach him at wayne@harlosrealestateteam.com or 303-229-3435. All right, let's continue. Before we move out of the subject of the fear of the duopoly and the Commission on Presidential Debates, here's the Los Angeles Times, and I actually misspoke. It was the Los Angeles Times, not the Washington Post, that called it an ongoing attack on truth. But, another very left-leaning editorial here. And I quote, "The debate commission represented another institution that set out rules and had structure that the president simply did not wish to abide," said Mitchell McKenney, a professor of political communication and a dean at the University of Akron. "What I'm fearful of, if the GOP rule passes, is that we could see some version of what we saw in those dueling town halls where candidates simply want to do their own thing." You want to know what? I think voters learn more when we see how the candidates do their own thing. It continues, "It's easy to shrug and wonder why that would matter. Most voters have decided whom they're going to vote for before a general election debate begins, but debates can influence a small slice of the electorate. I think it would influence an even larger slice if they actually allowed minority voices." And it ends with, "As long as Trump holds sway over the GOP, it's hard to imagine that the party's position will lead to a legitimate debate, and our democracy will suffer for it." Well, legitimate debate, if that's what you really want, Los Angeles Times, I look forward to your editorial saying that the Libertarian and perhaps the Green Party candidates should be in these debates, that any candidate that in theory is on enough ballots to win the race that could garner, at least in theory, enough electoral college votes to win the race should be included in the debates, but I will not be holding my breath on that one. Okay, and with that, we are now going to pivot into talking about Russia's attack upon the Ukraine. And it seems that both sides of the duopoly are pretty fond of calling it an unprovoked attack. And I am now just tempted to quote, or at least to channel, the Princess Bride and say, "Unprovoked. You keep using that word, but I do not think it means what you think it means." Now notice, just because I will be making the argument that the attack is not entirely quote unquote unprovoked does not mean it is justified. For instance, if I were to walk alongside you and call you all kinds of names and you got tired of it and punched me in the head, I would not think that was justified, but I also would not say it was unprovoked. It wasn't as if I was just walking along minding my own business. And I'm not saying it was necessarily provoked by the Ukraine itself. But there were provoking circumstances, and to call it unprovoked is quite simply a lie. Okay, welcome back. And before, starting on this discussion, which I'm sure is going to anger some people, just ask you to think for yourself, to try to look at all of the facts and not be my country, right or wrong, and we can never do anything wrong. Because the fact is, we do bear, as a country here in the United States, a great deal of culpability here. I'm going to repeat a meme. I'm going to meme quote something that I had posted on Twitter earlier, and I hope that you take this to heart before I continue. And it said, "I do not stand with Russia. I do not stand with Ukraine. I do not stand with NATO. I do not stand with the UN. I stand with the people in each country who are held hostages by governments that start wars, destroy economies, and subjugate our lives." And I stand by that. So I am again going to be using an article as a reference. This is from the Sheer Post, SCHEERPOST. And I'm going to start with the closing sentence of this article and then go through some of the major points. But the closing sentence says, "Now, as the world once again inches towards the brink of nuclear omnicide, it is more important than ever for Western audiences to understand and challenge their own government's role in dragging us all to this point." And that's what I'm going to be covering for potentially the remainder of this show. I'm not sure if I'm going to get to a piece I'd like to cover on inflation. But the title of this Sheer Post article is "Calling Russia's Attack, quote unquote, unprovoked, lets the U.S. off the hook." And I'll repeat, because I have a feeling I'm going to need to repeat this multiple times, because one of the first responses I got when I started a discussion on this topic on Twitter is, "So you support Russia? So you are buying all Russia talking points." You know, I remind you once again, I'm an anarchist. I don't buy any government's talking points, and I don't stand with any government. I'm also, as I've mentioned before, a pacifist. So I do not justify any kind of war or acts of aggression. But I do want to understand how we got here. And I do want to correctly characterize how we got here and lay fault properly where it belongs. And it's usually not just on one quote-unquote villain. It is so easy to make Putin out to be the arch-villain here, while refusing to look inward at our own responsibility. So, condemning Russia's act of aggression is the right thing to do. It is an act of aggression, and it is a violation of international law. However, I quote, "The unprovoked descriptor obscures a long history of provocative behavior from the United States in regards to Ukraine. This history is important to understanding how we got here and what degree of responsibility the U.S. bears for the current attack on Ukraine." And I think some of our feel-good actions, that none of them, there's been no justification offered for how any of these are going to solve anything, or maybe bring us back from war, or make this end sooner, or with less casualties. A lot of the things that people are calling for seem to be just feel-good actions that are harming everyday people and aren't really harming the governments, such as sanctions, which I completely oppose. And I think is eventually going to turn around and bite us in the rear, as we might already be seeing with Saudi Arabia flirting with China on the issue of, trading in oil with the Chinese yuan rather than the US dollar. Unintended consequences can be a real female dog, as it were. All right, and I am going to do some extensive quoting because I'm not going to be able to word it any better. And we are not hearing the full narrative, I don't think, from the mainstream media. And it says, "The story starts at the end of the Cold War, when the U.S. was the only global hegemon. As part of the deal that finalized the reunification of Germany, the U.S. promised," read my lips, "the U.S. promised Russia that NATO would not expand 1 inch," strong language, 1 inch eastward. Despite this, it wasn't long before talk of expansion began to circulate amongst policymakers. And on the front page of this article, it shows which countries joined NATO and/or the European Union before 1992, and which ones joined NATO and/or the European Union after, in 1992 or after. And we're inching closer and closer to Russia with those later countries, even despite the promise. When you break promises, there are ramifications to that. There are consequences to that. So I continue. In 1997, dozens of foreign policy veterans sent a joint letter to then President Clinton calling the current U.S.-led effort, note, U.S.-led effort to expand NATO a policy error of historical proportions. And they predicted in Russia, NATO expansion, which continues to be opposed across the entire political spectrum, will strengthen the non-democratic opposition, undercut those who favor reform and cooperation with the West, and bring the Russians to question the entire post-Cold War settlement. And I think that is exactly what we are seeing. Famed diplomat George Kennan in 1998, when he was asked about NATO's expansion, said, "I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anyone else." Of course, there is going to be a bad reaction from Russia, and then the NATO expanders will say that we always told you that this is just how the Russians are, but this is just wrong. It reminds me of, Bart Simpson, who, continually poking at Lisa. Ow, stop it. Ow, stop it. Ow, stop it. Well, when the inevitable punch comes, don't be surprised. And as Kennan said, no one was threatening anyone else. This was just doing it because we could. And you want to know what? You only get away with that for so long. So despite these warnings, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic were added to NATO in 1999, with Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia following in 2004. Imagine just something similar happening with us. If there was an alliance that we feared, that we felt was a threat to us, that kept creeping ever closer and closer, there will be a point in time when we're going to do something about it. U.S. planners were warned again in 2008 by U.S. Ambassador to Moscow William Burns, now director of the CIA under George Biden's. And WikiLeaks leaked a cable from Burns titled "Niet means Niet: Russia's NATO enlargement red lines," that included another prophetic warning that I am going to read in full because it's worth quoting in full, just as the article said. Ukraine and Georgia's NATO aspirations not only touch a raw nerve in Russia, they engender serious concerns about the consequences for stability in the region. Not only does Russia perceive encirclement, note that word, encirclement, and just imagine how we would react if we felt that way. I'm not even saying whether the feeling is justified. I'm just saying that the feeling exists. And efforts to undermine Russia's influence in the region, but it also fears unpredictable and uncontrolled consequences, which would seriously affect Russian security interests. Experts tell us that Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or, at worst, civil war. And in that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. We keep painting Putin as somebody eager for this choice. And I don't know his heart. Perhaps he was. But outside indicators indicate that he was not. And something that keeps getting obscured is that not too long ago, Ukraine was part of Russia. We are not talking about an area with this long history of independence that all of a sudden Russia is just coming in with no encouragement whatsoever. There are actually parts of Ukraine that want to be part of Russia. Now, I'm not saying that justifies anything. I am not saying that justifies dragging people who don't want to be part of Russia into Russia. I'm just saying that all of these facts need to be taken into consideration, because the binary thinking that we are encouraging in this country could lead eventually to World War III. And I'm sorry, I believe that could be the end of humanity. And is that worth it to you? Is it really? Now, I'm old enough to remember the end of the Cold War. I do not want to see a return to those times. I remember when President Reagan was called by my high school teachers President Ray-Gun. I sometimes, those of us who engage in this kind of rhetoric, I plead with you to stop and step back and think about what you are saying. We are playing a very, very dangerous game of nuclear roulette with life on this planet. This is something that we should be making every attempt to de-escalate and not escalate at all. And it seems like we are taking every action that is opposite to that end goal. All right, more after the break. All right, welcome back. And remember, you can always contact me with questions, comments, or advertising opportunities at pinkflameofliberty@gmail.com. And please come visit me on my YouTube channel of the same name. All right, let's continue with the provocations. The provocations for this unprovoked attack. So the next subsection here in this article is titled, A De Facto NATO Ally. It says, but the U.S. has pushed Russia to make such a decision on whether or not to intervene. Though European countries are divided about whether or not Ukraine should join, many in the NATO camp have been adamant about maintaining the alliance's open door policy. And this is despite the promise that we made, the not 1 inch eastward promise that we promptly broke. Even as U.S. planners were warning of a Russian invasion, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg reiterated NATO's 2008 plans to integrate Ukraine into the alliance. Even without officially being in NATO, Ukraine has become a de facto NATO ally, and Russia has paid close attention. And I want you, when you're listening to this, to put yourself in their shoes. It doesn't make things right, but what I'm trying to make things is understandable. It says, Putin expressed his concerns. Over the past few years, military contingents of NATO countries have been almost constantly present on Ukrainian territory under the pretext of exercises. The Ukrainian troop control system has already been integrated into NATO. This means that NATO headquarters can issue direct commands to the Ukrainian armed forces, even to their separate units and squads. A lot of the media attention we are seeing on this are omitting these very critical contexts and are just accelerating the beating of the drums of war. Do not forget, whenever you are listening to the explanations or the justifications, that there is the critical context of NATO's pledge not to expand, which was broken. Broken promises have consequences. Broken promises are provocation. And then it speaks about the Maidan, and I'm probably mispronouncing and butchering these names really badly, the Maidan coup of 2014. A major turning point in the U.S.-Ukraine-Russia relationship was the 2014 violent and unconstitutional ouster of President Viktor Yanukovych. I know I am mangling this. I apologize. In 2010. In a vote heavily split between the eastern and western Ukraine. His ouster came after months of protests led in part by far-right extremists. Of course, again, we're not allowed to talk about the actual Nazi problem that it does exist in some parts of the Ukraine. Weeks before his ouster, an unknown party leaked a phone call between U.S. officials discussing who should and shouldn't be part of the new government and finding ways to, quote-unquote, seal the deal. After the ouster, a politician the officials designated as, quote-unquote, the guy, even became prime minister. How is this not invading into Ukraine in a nonviolent way on our part? We cannot do these regime-building exercises all over the world and not expect what Ron Paul called blowback. The U.S. involvement was part of a campaign aimed at exploiting the divisions in Ukrainian society to push the country into the U.S. sphere of influence and pull it out of the Russian sphere. How can we not see this as provocation? Again, provocation is not justification. And another response to the overthrow, an uprising in Ukraine's Donbas region grew into a rebel movement that declared independence from Ukraine. And this is a group that actually wants to be part of Russia or its own republic. It says, Anatol Levine, a researcher with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, wrote in November of 2021, the main reason for the refusal is to comply with ceasefire agreement known as the Minsk II Accords, apart from a general commitment to retain centralized power in Kiev, has been the belief that permanent autonomy for the Donbass would prevent Ukraine from joining NATO and the European Union, as the region could use its constitutional position within Ukraine to block membership. All roads seem to lead back to NATO here. Ukraine opted instead to prolong the Donbass conflict, and there was never significant pressure from us, from the West, to alter course. There's no mention of the comments from a top Ukrainian official openly denouncing these peace accords, nor was it acknowledged that the U.S. could have used its influence to push Ukraine to solve the issue, but refrained from doing so. And what gets even more sinister here is it's discussed later on in the article, and I hope we get to it, as to there may be an underlying agenda that no matter which way this went, that somehow the U.S. could benefit from it. And we are using innocent people and other countries as chess pieces. But here's what most concerns me. The Ukrainian missile crisis is the next subheading here. One under-discussed aspect of this crisis is the role of U.S. missiles stationed in NATO countries. Many media outlets have claimed that Putin is Hitler-like, and boy, this is nothing like this. This is nothing like Germany's invasion, which was with the expressed aim of world conquest. Putin has not expressed this, no matter how much we try to impute this to him. You accuse someone of something long enough, and they might just live up to it. So many media outlets have claimed that Putin is Hitler-like, hell-bent on reconquering the old Soviet states to recreate the Russian Empire with himself as the Tsar, as Clinton State Department official Strobe Talbot told Politico. But Putin himself elaborated on what he considered to be the threat. He said, "It is extremely alarming that elements of the U.S. global defense system are being deployed near Russia. The Mk-41 launchers, which are located in Romania and are to be deployed in Poland, are adapted for launching the Tomahawk strike missiles. If this infrastructure continues to move forward, and if U.S. and NATO missile systems are deployed in Ukraine, their flight time to Moscow will only be 7 to 10 minutes, or even 5 minutes for hypersonic systems. This is a huge challenge for us, for our security. The United States does not possess hypersonic weapons yet, but we know when they will have it. They will supply hypersonic weapons to Ukraine and then use them as cover to arm extremists from a neighboring state and incite them against certain regions of the Russian Federation, such as Crimea, when they think circumstances are favorable. Do they really think we do not see this as threats? Or do they think that we will just stand idly watching threats to Russia emerge? This is the problem. We have no room to retreat. And I think when people tell us their motivations, unless we have some really compelling reasons to doubt them, and I'm not saying he's telling the entire truth. I don't trust any leaders. But we need to take this seriously. Having these missiles so close to Russia, weapons that Russia and China see as part of a plan to give the United States the capacity to launch a nuclear first strike without retaliation, which seriously challenges the Cold War deterrent of mutually assured destruction and more closely resembles a gun pointed at the Russian head for the remainder of the nuclear age. Would this be acceptable to any country? I'm asking you, would this be acceptable to us? No, it would not. And you know it, and I know it. And I continue By December 2021, U.S. intelligence agencies were sounding the alarm that Russia was amassing troops at the Ukrainian border and planning to attack. But Putin was clear about a path to de-escalation. We can disbelieve whether this was correct or not, but we'll never know because we did not take that path. He called on the West to halt NATO expansion, negotiate Ukrainian neutrality in the East-West rivalry, remove U.S. nuclear weapons from non-proliferating countries, and remove missiles, troops, and bases near Russia. These are demands the U.S. would surely have made were it in Russia's position, and we definitely would have. And again, maybe he was lying, but we will never know. And on NATO expansion, the State Department instead continued to insist that they would not compromise NATO's open door policy. In other words, it asserted the right to expand NATO and to ignore Russia's red line. We would never have tolerated that ourselves as a country. But instead, we have chosen to pour hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons into the Ukraine, which is an undeclared act of war, exasperating Putin's expressed concerns. And the Ukrainian president didn't help matters by suggesting that Ukraine might begin a nuclear weapons program at the height of the intentions. Had the U.S. been genuinely interested in avoiding war, it would have taken every opportunity to de-escalate the situation. Instead, it did the opposite nearly every step of the way. But the opportunity is not yet over. We can still insist on de-escalation, and we must. Okay, everyone, unfortunately, our time today has come to an end. Sorry to end on such a sober note, and I look forward to speaking with you next week.
You gotta take what you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians or choose to be an accountant because it's safe in the business, not because they want to